The morning air was sharp with desert chill, and Jake could feel it bite through his shirt as he stood in the dim barn. Dust motes floated in the sunlight, streaming through a crack in the boards, falling across the young woman's tense face. Her knife glittered faintly, steady in her hand despite the weakness in her posture. She was cornered but proud, and Jake had seen enough desperate folks to know that pride could make a person dangerous when they had nothing left to lose. Still, he held his ground, his tone measured, not wanting to spark panic. Her eyes never left his, searching him the way a wild creature might weigh a predator ready to bolt or strike. The horses shifted uneasily in their stalls, sensing the tension. Jake could hear his own heartbeat thudding, but he refused to show fear. Fear had no place out here. Instead, he studied her carefully, the worn moccasins, the frayed stitching on her tunic, the hollow hunger in her cheeks. She was running from something, that much was clear. But what? The woman's breath came fast at first, then slowed as she realized he wasn't charging forward. She shifted slightly, adjusting her balance, the knife still between them. Jake lifted his hands a little higher, palms out. "No trouble here," he said softly, his drawl steady. "You're cold, you're tired. I can see that plain as day. I ain't here to hurt you." For the first time, he thought he saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She wasn't sure whether to believe him or strike before he could act. He thought about the land beyond his ranch, the desert stretching empty for miles. If she had been out there alone, no wonder she looked so worn. Heat in the day, freezing air at night, little water, and worse, men who wouldn't hesitate to harm a woman like her if they found her. Jake wasn't one to get tangled in trouble, but he had to admit something about her stirred a protective instinct deep inside him. Maybe it was her courage, even cornered and half-starved, or maybe it was those eyes, dark and unyielding, meeting his without flinching. After a long silence, her grip on the knife loosened, just barely. She lowered it slightly, though she didn't put it away. "I only needed shelter," she repeated, her voice quieter now. Her accent marked her Apache roots, but her English was clear enough. Jake nodded slowly, lowering the pitchfork he'd forgotten he still held. The tension in the barn eased, but only a little. He could sense the weight of the choice before him: let her stay, and risk the wrath of neighbors who distrusted her kind; send her away, and know he might be dooming her to die alone in the desert. He rubbed the back of his neck, thinking hard. He wasn't a man to act on impulse. Years of working cattle, fending off rustlers, and surviving this hard land had taught him to measure risk. But some decisions weren't about survival, they were about what kind of man you wanted to be. He glanced at her again, seeing the way her shoulders sagged as exhaustion pulled at her, though she still fought to look strong. He made up his mind. "You can rest here a while," he said finally, "but only if you lay down that knife." His voice carried the weight of finality, leaving no room for argument. The young woman studied him, as though testing his words for weakness. Then, with deliberate slowness, she lowered the blade and placed it in her lap. Her movements were careful, precise, and Jake understood that this wasn't surrender, only a pause. She wasn't a woman used to trusting anyone. She folded her arms around herself, drawing the blanket tighter. The fight in her eyes dimmed just enough to let him see the bone-deep weariness there. She was clinging to the last of her strength. Jake exhaled, the knot in his chest loosening just a little. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe she might not strike. The barn fell quiet again, the only sounds the soft rustle of horses shifting in their stalls and the whisper of the desert wind against the boards. Jake stood watching her, still half expecting her to leap up and run, but she didn't move. Instead, she lowered her head, a strand of black hair falling across her cheek, and closed her eyes for a brief moment as if simply sitting still was the greatest relief she had known in days. Jake took a step back, giving her space. "I'll bring water," he said, his tone neutral. "You look like you could use it." She didn't answer, but her shoulders lifted slightly, as though she had heard. Jake left the barn, walking toward the well behind the house. His mind worked fast, already playing through the possibilities. If word got out that an Apache woman was on his property, he'd have questions to answer, questions he couldn't afford. Folks around here were quick to judge, and slower to forgive. But something stronger than fear tugged at him, kept him from sending her away. Maybe it was the way she'd held that knife, more in defense than aggression. Maybe it was the memory of her trembling hands. Whatever it was, He knew he couldn't turn his back. He returned with a tin cup of cool water, setting it on the edge of the hay beside her. She opened her eyes, glancing at him, then at the cup. For a heartbeat, he thought she might refuse, too proud to accept his charity. But her thirst won out. She reached for it with both hands, drinking greedily, though still careful not to turn her back to him. Jake watched her silently, noticing the cut along her jaw, the way her knuckles were scraped raw. She had been through more than she was telling. He wanted to ask but knew better than to press too soon. Trust wasn't something that could be forced. When she finished, she set the cup down gently, almost reverently, as though even that small kindness meant more than she would admit. Her dark eyes flicked toward him again, softer this time, though still guarded. Jake nodded once, tipping his hat slightly. Rest. We'll talk later. He turned to go, giving her privacy. But as he reached the barn door, her voice stopped him. Why? She asked. Just that one word, carrying all the suspicion and disbelief of someone who had been let down too many times. Jake paused, his hand on the doorframe, and answered without turning, because it's the right thing to do. Then he stepped out into the sunlight, leaving her to wonder what kind of man had just taken her in. Her name was Nita, and that alone carried weight in Jake's mind. He had never known an Apache personally, only heard tales, most of them told in saloons by men eager to make their own lives sound braver. But Nita wasn't a tale. She was flesh and blood, standing in his barn, proud despite her wounds. She swore she meant no harm, yet Jake understood the danger lingered not from her actions, but from what others would think if they discovered her. On the frontier, fear and prejudice often spoke louder than reason. Every day beyond his ranch, rumors stirred. Settlers blamed Apache raids for stolen cattle, missing supplies, even murders. The truth was usually murkier, but few cared to look deeper. For Jake, that tension was now inside his own fences. Nita's presence risked more than gossip. It risked his livelihood and possibly his life. Yet when he looked at her, hungry, wounded, and utterly alone, he couldn't harden his heart. Something told him sending her away would be the greater wrong. So he struck a deal. It wasn't charity, at least not on the surface. You can stay a while, he said, meeting her sharp gaze, but you'll work for it. It was the only way he knew to balance compassion with caution. She listened, lips pressed tight, then gave a single nod. She didn't thank him, not in words. Instead, she began to move, taking up the smallest tasks first, as if eager to prove herself useful before he could change his mind. The days that followed tested them both. Nita fetched water from the well, her slender arms steady despite her fatigue. She cared for the horses with surprising gentleness, whispering in a language Jake didn't understand. Even the skittish mare, who shied from most hands, leaned into Nita's touch. She mended tools, swept the barn, and accepted every chore without complaint. She worked silently, but not submissively. There was pride in her labor, a quiet dignity that reminded Jake she was no drifter. She carried herself with the strength of someone who had endured far worse than chores. Jake watched her from a distance, cautious not to intrude, but each day his curiosity grew. She spoke little, offering only what was necessary. He didn't press her for details of where she had come from, what she had fled, but he wondered. At night, as coyotes howled across the desert, he found himself staring into the fire, questions heavy in his chest. What had brought her here, of all places? Why his stable, his ranch? And why did he feel an unfamiliar pull every time her eyes brushed his? One evening, the air crisp with approaching autumn, they sat by the fire. The flames cast shadows across Nita's face, softening the hard lines of her exhaustion. For the first time, Jake saw something different, something almost vulnerably in her expression. She shifted slightly, her voice low but clear. "I thought you'd drive me out," she admitted. It wasn't an accusation, only a confession, a glimpse into her guarded heart. She had expected rejection, maybe even violence, because that was what life had taught her to expect from men like him. Jake tipped his hat, his usual gesture of respect. He wasn't much for words, but this moment demanded honesty. "Maybe fate had other plans," he replied. The truth was, he didn't understand why he had let her stay, only that it felt right. The desert had its own way of deciding who crossed paths, who lived and who didn't. Maybe, just maybe, Nita was meant to be here, and he was meant to find her. The thought unsettled him, yet it also warmed him in a way he hadn't felt in years. The nights grew cooler, and the work of the ranch continued. Nita proved herself again and again. She never asked for more than food and a place to rest, never complained when the chores were heavy. Jake found himself depending on her in small ways: an extra hand to guide the cattle, an extra set of eyes to watch the horizon. Slowly, his wariness shifted into trust. He began to notice things: the way she hummed softly while grinding corn, the way her braids swung neatly against her back, the rare curve of a smile when she thought no one was watching. Yet danger was never far. Jake knew his neighbors well enough to realize whispers would spread quickly if Nita were discovered. Already, he limited his trips into town, worried someone might follow him back. He imagined the questions. Why was an Apache woman living under his roof? Was he a sympathizer, a traitor? Men in the saloon liked to boast about killing Apache raiders. They would find no humor in Jake's quiet act of mercy. Every decision he made carried the weight of risk. But still, he did not send her away. For Nita, the adjustment was different. Each day she worked, she watched Jake with cautious eyes. He was not like the men she had known before, those who carried rifles and hatred into her people's lands. He was steady, patient, and oddly gentle in his silence. She found herself wondering why he offered her shelter, when others would have offered chains or bullets. At night, when she lay in the barn wrapped in blankets, she thought of her tribe, of what she had lost, and of the strange cowboy whose kindness unsettled her more than cruelty ever could. Their conversations grew slowly, piece by piece. Jake asked about her chores, her injuries, her strength. She answered in few words, never volunteering more than she wished. He respected that. Trust, he knew, couldn't be rushed, but there were moments, a small, fleeting where she let her guard down. She laughed once when his hound tripped over its own paws. She offered him herbs from the desert, showing him how they could ease pain. Each moment stitched them closer together, though neither spoke of it aloud. The desert had ears, and some truths felt too fragile to name. Then came the night when trouble finally found them. A band of riders appeared on the horizon, neighbors who had heard whispers of strangers on Jake's land. They came with questions, with suspicion in their eyes. Jake stood at his gate, calm but firm, while Nita hid in the shadows of the barn, every muscle taut with fear. The men asked about Apache sign near his property, about rumors of a woman seen fetching water at his well. Jake's answer was steady, ain't seen a soul but my own stock. His lie carried weight, and after tense moments, the riders moved on. When they were gone, Nita emerged slowly, her face pale. She had lived her life expecting betrayal, yet Jake had risked his name and safety to protect her. Something in her shifted at night. For the first time, she looked at him not as a wary stranger but as someone who might be different, someone she could trust. She said little, only whispered, you could have given me up. Jake met her gaze and answered simply, that ain't who I am. And with those words, the fragile thread of trust between them grew stronger. As the days stretched into weeks, Jake realized the ranch no longer felt the same. It was fuller somehow, alive in ways it hadn't been before Nita arrived. He caught himself listening for her footsteps, waiting for her quiet voice. He wondered if this was what companionship felt like, an unexpected, unspoken, but undeniable. He didn't know what the future held. The frontier was too wild to make promises. But one truth became clear: Nita was no longer just a guest. She was a part of his world now, and whether by fate or chance, he couldn't imagine sending her away. The fire crackled one evening as they sat in silence. The desert stars spread vast above them. Nita glanced at Jake, her eyes reflecting the flames. Perhaps, she murmured, the spirits brought me here. Jake smiled faintly, his hat tipped low. He wasn't sure about spirits, but he knew about destiny, the kind that sneaks up on a man when he isn't looking. He realized then that Nita had already become more than a chance encounter. She was the turning point in his story, the reason the lonely desert didn't feel so empty anymore. And deep down, he knew she was meant to stay.